If you want, we can take place. We are ready to start.
Okay. Buongiorno a tutti. Good morning to everyone. Today we have the open lecture, the open lesson of our PhD in contemporary humanism. And this is a very special day because we have an outstanding professor. So thank you very, very much for your presence, for to spend a day here in LUMSA. As you know, our contemporary humanism PhD is an international PhD developed in partnership with other outstanding university in all over the world. Firstly, Notre Dame. We hope that Notre Dame is. Thank you, because the program of today is organized in collaboration with Notre Dame University, and our PhD is developed with other Catholic university. Australian Catholic University, Institut Catholique de Paris, Lyon Catholic University, the Catholic University of Lisbon, Portuguese, and also Catholic University in Chile. And now we expect to the new partner, Notre Dame University. So is a PhD very, very international, because we organize a program in partnership with our university, and the PhD give the opportunity to take a double degree, a double PhD, if a student spend a period at least 1 year in another country, in another university. So we are very, very happy to develop this PhD, and thank you again to our coordinator, Stefano Bianco, that spent very many time to manage this complex PhD. Thank you again, and a good day.
Thank you, Gennaro. My name is Stefano Bianco, and I am an associate professor of moral philosophy and the coordinator of the PhD program in contemporary humanism. It is my honor and pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Professor Cyril O'Regan. Professor O'Regan earned his PhD at Yale University and is currently professor of theology at the University of Notre Dame in the US. Professor O'Regan is globally known for his books, among which I'd like to recall at least The Heterodox Hegel, published in 1994, Gnostic Return in Modernity, published in 2001, Gnostic Apocalypse, Jacob Böhme's Haunted Narrative, published in 2002, The Anatomy of Misremembering, von Balthasar's Response to Philosophical Modernity, Volume 1, Hegel, published in 2014. The second volume on Heidegger is forthcoming. Professor O'Regan is also a poet who has written a couple of poetry collections entitled Origin in Alexandria, Poems Sacred and Profane, and The Companion of Theseus. For his intellectual work, Professor O'Regan will receive tomorrow in the Vatican the prestigious Ratzinger Prize. And we have today with us Father Lombardi, who is the president of the Ratzinger Foundation. If I had to give a lecture on his work, I recall his thesis on the Gnostic return in modernity, his outstanding and sympathetic reading of von Balthasar's work, his sort of apocalyptic turn, his extensive knowledge not only of the fathers of the Church, Irenaeus, Origen, but also of the modern philosophy. But my duty today is not to give a lecture on Professor O'Regan's work. Today, we have the great opportunity to hear from his own voice what he has to say. Allow me instead to shortly underline in my own words the importance and the significance of his work. While preparing this short introduction, a beautiful passage came to mind from the famous book by Richard Niebuhr, The Kingdom of God in America, published in 1937. I quote, "A God without wrath brought man without sin into a kingdom without judgment through the ministrations of a Christ without a cross." This, I think, is the danger Professor O'Regan warns us against, the danger of building, through our conceptualization, a sort of fake Christianity that closely resembles the real one, but misses what is essential. These are false doubles of Christianity, that is, counterfeit doubles where something is either missing or reconfigured in a way that makes it hard to even identify the double as such and to differentiate it from the original. Borrowing a famous Kierkegaard's category, I would say that what it happens with these doubles is that a sort of memory of Christianity still exists, but the contemporaneity with Christ becomes impossible. Christianity is then reduced to a corpse. Like our Greek predecessors who listened to Paul in the Areopagus, as intellectuals, we are in danger of dreaming of a disincarnate false Christianity, a Christianity which is then without resurrection. More in general, I think this is a danger that, as intellectuals, we always run whatever object we deal with. We are in danger of building an abstract, dead duplicate of the real world. Professor O'Regan's work reminds us of the need to always take the concrete seriously. To borrow his own words, his entire work is an apology for flesh, incarnation, and word, and a protest against intellect, abstraction, Cartesianism, angelism. Thank you, dear Cyril, for accepting our invitation. We are really happy to listen to your lecture entitled The Drama of Christian Humanism. Before giving you the floor, please let me just thank Silvia Dall'Olio, the director of the University of Notre Dame, who has made this event possible. Thank you, Silvia, and thank you, Cyril. The floor is yours.
Let me also begin with thanks. Thanks to the cooperation between Professor Banco and Cyril Dall'Olio, and hopefully this liaison will continue and is not simply an episode which has the proper name of Cyril O'Regan. There is a handout, and the handout is meant to do two things. On the one hand, it's intended to be an aid to those people who have as much difficulty understanding Italian as some of you might have understanding English. I'm going to speak at American English pace. I'm not going to speak English at an Italian pace, which of course is what you would find in Dublin, Ireland. For that, I think, since we're talking about gratitude, you now need to extend gratitude to me, that I'm not going to do that to you. The outline indicates that there is a kind of prelude or overture with respect to Christian humanism, or at least Christian humanism and its possibility and impossibility in modernity. The second, and this obviously will be a much longer part and far more substantial, is on Henri de Lubac's Christian humanism and his construction or implied construction of secular modernity and its challenges. And the third part is on Joseph Ratzinger's Christian humanism and the nature, again, of secular modality and modernity rather, and its challenges. I have a rather elaborate conclusion, which I might actually deliver or not deliver. And if I don't deliver, I will end my paper with a provocation. And the provocation, just in case I don't get to it, or for some reason I don't remind myself of it, will be that while much of the lecture will be posing via Henri de Lubac and Joseph Ratzinger the problems of modernity and the ways and the different ways in which it needs to be resisted, this does not mean that Christianity in general, or Catholic Christianity in particular, should resist any help, particularly from philosophy, that it might get, even if those philosophies themselves are queried and interrogated. So with that, I now abrogate all responsibility with respect to you understanding the lecture, because the second part of the handout is, it will indicate that there is an argumentative progression in the paper, and should my English not be sufficiently American, nonetheless, I think just consult the outline, and the outline will at least tell you what I intended to achieve. Of course, it won't help you necessarily in making the judgment that I actually achieved what I intended. And with that, I start. Christian humanism does not become an operative intellectual category until the end of the 15th or beginning of the 16th century, with the emerging concern for human creativity and making, as well as the coming to grips with, on the one hand, newfound knowledge of ancient texts, and on the other, the dawning consciousness of the promise of a knowledge of nature that unveils its secrets and confers on us the status of sovereigns who can dispose of it as we see fit. If the rise of Protestantism accepted the reality of the conjunction and did not contest the category, it did so only in order to object all the more vehemently to its reality, the reality of the conjunction of humanism and Christianity, that it judged to be a corruption, and the category nothing less than the confession of the betrayal of true faith, fully rendered in Scripture. While the humanists like Erasmus thought of humanism as a new moment of religious and cultural integration, he did not consider the integration as in itself revolutionary. If over the centuries, the record of the Church with regard to negotiating with culture and countenancing reason and balancing it with faith was decidedly mixed, rarely enthusiastic, and often compromised by either political considerations or the earnestness of pure faith. If again, and not infrequently, the Church's thinking was marked by obtuseness, still there were throughout Western history significant achievements in culture and thought, examples enough of happy coincidences between faith and reason, so as not to dismiss the entire Christian interregnum as folly. If the Reformation critique was largely prescriptive when it came to Christian humanism and railed against compromises of pure faith and its inattention to human depravity. Enlightenment criticism was largely descriptive, whether coming from those who are urging a new organon of science and its limitless vistas, such as Francis Bacon, or those engaged in a critique of Christian history, its scriptures, its creeds, its behaviors, its institution, as this is conducted in different registers by the likes of Bayle, Voltaire, and Diderot. They too concurred, but from the other side, that Christian humanism was a contradiction in terms, and in all times and in every way, Christianity in general and Catholicism in particular has shown that it was anti-humanistic to its very core. In satire and straight-up pontification, it repeatedly announced that Christianity was a relic of the past. Its term that was about to expire was the Dark Ages. In the 18th century, the mandates flowed endlessly. The public is encouraged to come into the light and thereby to gain knowledge of which they are fully capable, knowledge of the natural and social worlds, and embrace the human flourishing made possible by this knowledge. But there are also particular mandates to take culture itself seriously and to define its nature and its capacities, for example, Vico. And of course, there is Kant's cheerleader cry of sapere aude, the exhortation to dare to know that rings out in his famous essay on the Enlightenment. Sublimely inadequate as the above sketch is, nonetheless, perhaps as prelude and overture, it is sufficient to indicate that in modernity, Christian humanism becomes not only a contested category, but a category that was regarded as a contradiction in terms. Perhaps as a kind of signature of the contradictory nature of the category, we might think of Sartre's famous essay at the end of the Second World War, Existentialism is a Humanism, as an inflection point, because in it, with Nietzsche as his foremost example, he lays bare that true humanism is necessarily atheistic. If Sartre has brought Nietzsche forward into the 20th century, albeit in a different way than the fascists who had expropriated him, he was also bringing up to date the kind of a humanism advanced by Voltaire, which was far less heroic than that espoused by Sartre, and which left intact a bare belief in God, even if this made little sense after the demolition of the integrity of Scripture, the validity of doctrine, and the credibility of a church given to stupidity, status, scapegoating, and violence. That's the prelude. Now turn to the Lubac. Now, I'm assuming that many of you heard in the title of my paper the echo of Henri de Lubac's The Drama of Atheistic Humanism, written just a year earlier, that is 1945. And indeed, that some of you may even have guessed that it plays a major role in the argument I'm going to make eventually about the Christian humanism of Ratzinger. The basic grounds for the argument is that the theology of Ratzinger is not only influenced by the Lubac's retrieval of the Catholic past in its full breadth and depth, but also by the French Jesuits' polemic against the anti-Christian or post-Christian visions and worldviews that have come to infiltrate First World culture, and particularly European culture, to the degree that we might think of them, after Charles Taylor, of shaping the social imaginary. The drama referred to in the title of de Lubac's book refers then to the agon, or struggle, between the church and its modern visionary rivals that can be regarded as both a reckoning and a crisis, and thus, in a sense, woven into a reading of the apocalypse and the Christian obligation to name the adversary. It is not clear whether de Lubac has read Interroge l'Apocalypse of his favorite French author, Paul Claudel. But in the Drama of Atheistic Humanism, he envisages a battle between the Christian view of the world and human being against totalizing visions that tempt because of their imaginative appeal, but which in the end are unveiled as simulacra of the kind of humanism that Christianity has to offer, in which human beings are truly human only in their relation to God and are fully realized or personated to the extent that they have been formed in a church that reads and is read into Scripture and shaped by sacrament. Or in short, have come to participate in a church considered as mystery precisely because it is the sacrament of salvation. Some figures with whom de Lubac deals are figures who have had massive social consequence in the 20th century, figures such as Marx and Nietzsche. Yet de Lubac also deals with lesser lights, such as Feuerbach, who anticipates Marx, while arguably offering a less agonistic view of the human condition than his more famous successor. And Comte, whose positivism elevates science above metaphysics and religion, while also showing that he thinks that science is the new religion, insofar as it has become the discourse with revelatory properties. What all these forms of thought have in common, according to de Lubac, is that they present a picture of the prospect of an elevated humanity far beyond the rational man of the Enlightenment, and provide both a schema and program of heaven and earth after the so-called wearing away of the imaginative hold of Christianity, which Nietzsche glamorously and with typical hyperbole refers to as the death of God. In Le Drame, of course, de Lubac does not directly oppose these rival visions hatched in the secular environment to the vision espoused by the Catholic Church. Rather, he uses Dostoevsky, who understands better than anyone else, plausibly because he has existentially felt the pull of all of them, to represent a Christian countervision to the imaginative alternatives thrown up in the secular age. The choice of Dostoevsky as a kind of Christian proxy, even Catholic proxy, is motivated and follows on a similar use of the Russian novelist by Hans Urs von Balthasar in Volume 2 of Apocalypse der Deutschen Seele, to combat the emerging secular consensus from within its own borders. De Lubac's canvas is narrow compared with that of Balthasar, even if there are points of overlap with respect to figures such as Nietzsche and Marx. Yet of the two great resource-monk theologians, it is de Lubac who more clearly draws out what is at stake. It is not simply that with respect to the figures with which it deals, the Drame provides a far more detailed account, but that the presentations he provided are sympathetic enough to see the attractions of these anti-Christian or post-Christian alternatives, while also searching enough to expose what is fallacious and fantastic in them. Now, it is easy to underestimate de Drame. The text is underestimated to the extent to which one ignores the constitutively critical and genealogical nature of de Lubac's work, that is illustrated not only by le Drame, but also by the text that essentially brings down the curtain to de Lubac's fabulous career. That is, La postérité spirituelle de Joachim de Fleur. In that text, de Lubac speaks to the legacy of Joachim, not only throughout the Middle Ages and the critical and forensic use to which Joachim was put in the Reformation, in its critique of the Catholic Church, but also the career of Joachimism in Lessing and German idealism, and on to contemporary theology, as well as Joachim's more indirect effects in the various forms of French socialism of the 19th century. In La postérité, Proudhon, on whom de Lubac wrote extensively, is the hinge not only because he is the most comprehensive of all the varieties of French socialism, but also because his work seems to be the most evocative of the gospel. In Balthasar's short and appreciative book on de Lubac, even as he affirms de Lubac's manifold retrievals of the tradition with regard to the reading of Scripture, the theological tradition, the nature of doctrine and creed, as well, of course, his luminous reflections on the Church. The Swiss theologian, somewhat surprisingly, claims La postérité to be de Lubac's most important text. In rendering this bold assessment, Balthasar is, of course, agreeing with de Lubac that in the modern age, both within and outside the Church, both directly and indirectly, there is a sense of the power of spirit no longer anchored in the Church as institution. And it is this non-anchoring that must be resisted. Spirit has become a free radical and thus intrinsically opposed to conjunctions of institution and charism and Christ and the Holy Spirit that were favored by Catholicism throughout its long history. Just as importantly, if not even more so, what Balthasar seems to have grasped is that, as with his own work, in La postérité, de Lubac has come to understand more clearly and more fully that critique and genealogy are essentially the complements to the activity and art of retrieval in all this breadth and depth. At the same time, however, de Drame and de Lubac's other critical and genealogical works can come to be overestimated to the extent to which one comes to consider genealogy and polemic as sufficient for the Church in the modern age. Visionary forms of thinking, which either offer an alternative to Christian vision or represent a distortion of it, should be called out. Both de Lubac and Balthasar do precisely this. Still, nothing can substitute for the gathering and deploying of the richness and the riches internal to the Church, whereby it gives an account of itself that can rise to the level of a visionary lodestar for those who are confused and agitated in the Church, and those outside of it inclined to be persuaded that the Church is not the oppressive, juridical, and self-interested body that its modern critics have made it out to be. For de Lubac, the Church persuades without as well as within when it comes to embrace all that is thoughtful and life-giving in its own history. Thus far, I've stressed the complementarity of these different modalities of retrieval and critique found in de Lubac's oeuvre. The operations of retrieval and critique, while distinct, are not entirely separate from each other. The gathering of the riches of the tradition is essential to the recovery of an ecclesial identity that may have been depleted because of the unconscious influence by the emerging discourses of modernity, as these have been facilitated either by their prestige or relevance or both. Yet this recovery is also an engagement with modernity, in that the Church can now give not only a bold account of itself, as St. Paul requested to give, but also an account of itself far more likely to be persuasive than the bare assertions of the Church's prerogatives and its presentation of affidavits of its authority that marked the Church's response to secular modernity from the 1860s to the 1930s. In addition, and this is the point I want to underscore here, it is precisely in and through this act of remembering that another and more basic layer of secular modernity is exposed. Recollection of the extent and breadth of the Christian past enacted in de Lubac's oeuvre comes to make complete sense to the extent that it implies that forgetting is effectively built into the secular age, which prompts, reinforces, and at a limit regulates the Church's own forgetting. In addition to being an internal good of the Church, recollection has critical value regarding the secular culture brought into being by the Enlightenment that sponsored forgetting of the Christian tradition and its complex relations with both reason and culture. In modern secular culture, this forgetting is operational, insofar as attention is given only to the relative rationality or irrationality of the present and the planning for the future that gives it its real meaning. At the same time, forgetting is not only operational, it is also a matter of theory. The Enlightenment is predicated on a break with tradition. This, I take it, Blumenberg has established. Forgetting is a mandate. The Enlightenment, however, itself does not become past because there are visions it sponsors. For de Lubac, it continues to provide the ground and horizon for secular modernity, with respect to which the visionary alternatives to Christianity, of which he speaks in Notre Dame and La Postérité, can be counted as complements and supplements. However negatively they speak of the Enlightenment that made them possible. Now, if such is the case, then de Lubac's immense active memory across diverse fields of Christian history, discourse, and practice has an implied critical genealogical element in that the kind of memory exhibited is precisely what the Enlightenment rules out. Thus so, it explains why de Lubac is inclined to engage in the critique of these alternative imaginative rivals that post-date the emergence of the Enlightenment, while not focusing to the same extent on the continuing effects of the Enlightenment in the secular world in terms of separation of church and state, the immense prestige of instrumental reason and technology, and the dissemination of Enlightenment values of the individual and the common good in society at large. For de Lubac, the Enlightenment values serve as the base of these modern visions that rival Christianity. Each of these visions presupposes the Enlightenment by assuming that the Enlightenment has made its case against Christianity. This allows each of these visionary discourses to move forward, to critically engage the Enlightenment, with regard to what constitutes human flourishing as well as the generation of community, while compensating for the abstractness of the Enlightenment by thinking more urgently, more globally, speaking more presently, and more in the mode of revolution than reform. In advocating for heroic mentalities in which human beings are characterized by modes of transcendence that lead them to occupy the space and the role once occupied by God. Perhaps as a side observation relating to the understanding and construction of modernity is in order. As I stand back, implicitly at least, it seems to me, de Lubac has a similar view to Charles Taylor about the complex nature of modernity, and thus the complexity of the challenges that it poses to the church and the religious believer. One stream of his practices and recommendations, one stream of it practices rather, and recommends a form of reason that maps and masters the world in self. The other stream, that is, the visionary stream in which Hegel, Marx, and Nietzsche stand out, will correct what is attenuated or left unthought by the Enlightenment and engage the whole person, at once affective and imaginative as well as rational. Both aspects, what Deleuze would refer to as foes, have to be taken on. De Lubac, however, is far less resigned than Taylor about the prospects of Christianity coming out whole and intact in the emergence of secular modernity that enfolds everyone and all institutions. Taylor is sufficiently historicist to claim that what has occurred over the past few centuries and what was given birth to in the Reformation cannot be revoked. But adding the complement that on balance, both the Enlightenment and the visionary discourses and practices that succeeded it were, as a matter of fact, a net gain, just as he also advances the claim that they were a net human good. Avant la lettre, de Lubac demurs. First, Christianity can mount a successful counterattack against both by recovering the full extent of what it is. And the church can rediscover who it is. And secondly, with respect to the Enlightenment and the visionary worlds whose conjuring it made possible, on de Lubac's account, the losses exceed the gain, whether one is thinking of the individual or social good. To recur to the title of my paper, here is what I think de Lubac has indicated about the possibility and the basic contours of a theistic or Christian humanism. First, the affirmation of Christian humanism is now necessarily self-conscious. Its context is a secular modernity in which a separated reason has presumptive authority, and which is also ideologically populated by an array of visionary options offering a comprehensive grasp of the world and human making. The drama is the drama of having to make a fundamental choice of worldview, and in particular, taking on the burdensome responsibility of resisting the atheistic option that has two registers, and arguing to the contrary, that it is only in Christianity that the fullness of human beings is realized. Tradition, sacred text, liturgy, a sense of dependence to match the courage to explore, the Christian virtues of faith, hope, and charity, in addition to the socially secured virtues, or the virtues that make security possible. A sense of mystery that blocks hubris, and a sense of the communion of persons, each valued despite as much as because of the level of achievement. All these play a role regarding the constitution of an authentic humanism that, in this instance, is necessarily a Christian humanism. I now turn to part 3 in Ratzinger. As I move into the third part of my paper, I'd like to issue a clarification and also provide directions as to where I'm going by fairly broadly stating my thesis. Clarification bears on the language of theistic humanism. It's fairly obvious that in the case of de Lubac, the proper locution, in the end at least, is Christian humanism, since he is convinced that only a reason bathed in the Catholic ethos would be sufficient to resist the distortion of reason and counter the visionary options available in the secular age. While Ratzinger allows reason to have somewhat more scope than in de Lubac, and upholds Socrates as a model for the Christian pursuit of truth, and Plato as a philosopher who insists on its transcendence and its guidance, he also believes that only to the degree to which reason is taken into the horizon of faith, in which it is elevated, does its truly dramatic character appear. With regard to my thesis, permit me to state it in a fashion at once bold and peremptory. The theology of Ratzinger represents a variant and development of the complex of memory and critical genealogical diagnosis that we observe to be operative in the work of Henri de Lubac, and that over his career, that is Ratzinger's career, he strove to fill in the outlines. The memorial function of Ratzinger's theology is relatively transparent. It is to be found across the different fields of his theological inquiries. For example, in his early historical studies of Augustine and Bonaventure, in his groundbreaking study on the Apostles' Creed and Introduction to Christianity, in the way in which he tackles the topics of creation and last things in concert with the Catholic tradition in general and the broad Augustinian tradition in particular, in both his outlining of a biblical hermeneutics and his actual exegesis, especially in the 3-volume Jesus of Nazareth, in his voluminous studies on liturgy and the sacraments, and finally in the ways in which he insists on the intrinsic connection between faith and reason, the unconditionality of truth, the reality of conscience, and the ethical foundation of all politics. Relative to de Lubac, Ratzinger's operation of retrieval is significantly less copious, while also being far more targeted. This comes across especially in Ratzinger's essays, which, if the fruit of an accommodation to an inordinately busy life in the service of the church, also display real genius of economy and analytic sharpness. One can also observe that critique and counter-genealogical diagnosis are yoked to the retrievals of crucial features of the Christian tradition. Throughout his long writing career, Ratzinger resists post-Enlightenment discourses that have their roots in Hegel and Marx, whether in the mode of South and Central American forms of liberation theology, or the various modes of political theology in Europe that do business with Marx or with Ernst Bloch as a more acceptable variant. Compared with Enlightenment forms of thought that tend to be proceduralist, perhaps Habermas is the most sophisticated modern version of this, these forms of discourse are visionary and exercise a captivating spell, being able to unlock the truth of the whole and human beings' privileged place within it. With respect to the former, In his capacity as head of the CDF, Ratzinger judged that some forms of liberation theology, notice, some forms of liberation theology, Leonardo Boff is the example, tend to be compromised by a visionary anthropology and sociology inimical to Christian faith. With respect to the latter, whether in his magisterial eschatology and latterly as Pope in Spe Salvi, Ratzinger takes issue with European forms of political theology, indebted to Hegel or Marx. Now, his dispute with these forms of theology is not merely academic, nor is his aggravation a matter of personal taste or distaste. What is backgrounded and merely implicit in de Lubac is now made fully explicit in Ratzinger. The horizon is apocalyptic, insofar as our age is the age of crisis, in which we have to choose between competing worldviews. In referring to Solovius' apocalyptically inflected Three Tales of the Antichrist, which also, of course, profoundly influenced Dostoevsky's famous construction of the Grand Inquisitor, Ratzinger makes it plain what is at stake. Yet he also makes more explicit than de Lubac that the scene of apocalyptic decision is a scene of temptation in which a worldview that fundamentally opposes Christianity can dress itself in Christian colors and indeed possess distinct advantages over the real thing, because it is far more glamorous, apparently far more just, and definitely and far more obviously socially pertinent and transformative. Ratzinger then issues a definitive negative judgment against visionary discourses that belong to the second layer of the Enlightenment. His canvas is smaller than that of de Lubac, which in turn is smaller than what we find in Balthasar, especially as illustrated in his Apocalypse der Deutschen Seele. Nonetheless, it is intense. Furthermore, there are references throughout his work, and not simply his monumental book on Bonaventure, concerning Joachim de Fiore. In Ratzinger, the recall does not function to unlock, in genealogical fashion, the inner nature of Hegel and Marx themselves, that's de Lubac, and the forms of theology and movement they engender. Rather, the recall is intended to provide a pedigree for the basic operative grammar of the contemporary opposition between letter and spirit, and between institution and charism. And even more particularly, the distinction between the letter and spirit of Vatican II, routinely made by those whom Ratzinger believes willfully misinterpret the Council. The Council was indeed an epochal event, but one with sufficient continuity with the past to justify refusing the designation in the language of postmodernity as event or event tout court, thus pointing to complete rupture or décalage. In Ratzinger, we can see the focus on visionary discourse. We can see the drama, indeed the escalation of the drama of apocalyptic decision and choice. Still, it should be observed that with respect to the challenges presented by visionary discourses, Ratzinger focuses his attention almost entirely on the one that has the most immediate deleterious effect on Christian doctrines and the understanding of the Church. The discourse of Hegel and Marx, that's what I'm talking about, might be thought to function as a kind of synecdoche, that is, pars pro tota of the whole, of the entire span of visionary discourses in modernity, including Nietzsche and other forms of nihilism. Perhaps in this regard, as with many others, Augustine is a model for for Ratzinger. I'm thinking especially of Augustine's critique of Manichaeism, carried out over 2 decades, involving over 20 texts, I think it might be 24, and having its high point in Contra Faustum. Manichaeism is a visionary discourse that insists on its truth, while not necessarily as showing affidavits on its own behalf. It is a discourse which refuses argument, refuses vulnerability. It is also a liminal discourse, in that, like Hegelian and Marxist discourses, it exists at a limit, at once outside and inside, at once an enemy outside the gates of Christianity to be defended against. It's a different thing. But also an enemy inside the gates, because we actually have Christian forms of Manichaeism that have come to successfully masquerade as Christian. Ratzinger is fairly economical in the scope of his critique of the second phase, and thus second layer of the secular age, that sets the table for what we moderns think, feel, and do. He's also scrupulously reserved in ways that neither de Lubac nor Balthasar are, when it comes to a genealogy of modern discourses that would challenge or assimilate or occupy Christian theological discourses. The Ratzinger seems to be sympathetic to de Lubac's view of modern visionary discourses dating back to Joachim, or at least repeating his basic visionary structure and elevation of human capacity. He does not assert it. Most certainly he eschews the kind of genealogical experiments that mark the work of Balthasar, who variously points to modern discourses, both inside and outside the church, as Gnostic, as Marcionite, as apocalyptic, or as radical or radicalized forms of Neoplatonism. Nevertheless, we should not be dismissive of Ratzinger's focus on Hegel-Marx, or his timid hinting of the return of Joachim in modernity. Discourses of Hegel and Marx, whether singly or together, have had enormous historical impact in modernity. One or other of both have made their way into European high culture discourse. For example, in thinkers as different as Sartre and Althusser in France, Gramsci in Italy, Badiou and Zizek, and of course, not to forget Adorno and Horkheimer, and latterly Habermas. And of course, as for the ghost of Joachim, even philosophers such as Vatimo and Agamben, who can be more nearly placed in the line of Heidegger and Nietzsche, we can either notice the explicit recall or espy hints and shades of Joachim's presence, even if we would have to say that Vatimo is the more obviously Joachim haunted of the two, or certainly the one who most explicitly brings these deaths to Joachim to light. In any case, when it comes to the first level of secular modernity that serves as both base and horizon, Ratzinger is significantly in advance of de Lubac, whose register with regard to the critique of modern reason is more nearly implicit than explicit. Even an episodic reader of Ratzinger will have noticed the recurring critique of enlightened reason and his consistent rebuttal of the rationalist critique of Christianity and the church, as well, of course, also his critique of historical critical method with regard to the Bible that displays its Enlightenment origins. Now, whether one reads Locke, Voltaire, or the Philosophe, the objections to Christianity are mind-numbingly the same. Christianity is sub-rational, obscurantist, fanatical, intolerant, servile, and because of all of the foregoing, ultimately capable and culpable of sponsoring violence. The church possesses all of these negative traits while having the status and power to be oppressive and repressive, its major interest, according to the standard critique or critiques, being its own self-reproduction. Throughout his long career, most certainly from the 1980s on, Ratzinger engages in a protracted defense of Christianity and the church from what he thinks are caricatures and calumnies, and routinely goes on the counterattack. Christianity is not sub-rational, rather it is super-rational, which is not to claim that one can vouch for every Christian and every Christian group across history. Nor is it the case that Christianity has been systemically fanatical and violent. Witness his objections to this construction in both the Regensburg lecture and his long essay rebutting Assmann's construction of Christianity. Though again, Ratzinger, prudent and wise, is not prepared to sanction the violent behavior of Christians throughout a somewhat checkered history. Now, I think it is fair to say that Ratzinger's basic protocol for understanding the church is Augustinian. While lifting the church up by speaking to the church after Lumen Gentium and after de Lubac as mystery and sacrament, and also reminding of how the church calls us not only to be responsive to God, but also to each other, and to promote truth and beauty as well as goodness. Ratzinger also acknowledges that the church has routinely failed to make Christ transparent to the world. Nonetheless, the reality of holiness is such, and the reality of holiness to distortion is such, that one can rule out both the Reformation and the Enlightenment's construction of the church as wholly corrupted or vitiated. The church is the locus and vehicle of salvation. At the same time, however, the church is the corpus permixtum, the mixed body that will house the bad with the good, the errant with the steady, and the liberating and wholesome with what is compulsive, degrading, and degenerating. Ratzinger's response to the grievous failures of the church is neither exculpation nor alibi, but rather realism regarding the shadow cast in the church between aspiration and performance, a shadow that calls for correction and repentance. Considered broadly, Ratzinger launches an intellectual counterattack against the Enlightenment horizon of secular modernity that exerts massive sway in Europe, but is built to disseminate everywhere and ready to function as a set of assumptions ready at hand, not themselves subject to question. Indeed, more or less immunized from the very critique that it sponsors. Ratzinger calls out the relativism of the secular world, perhaps also its implicit nihilism that refuses the task of truth. Ratzinger is generic here and does not distinguish between variants of relativism, for instance, whether they are modern or postmodern. Given that he might have had some influence in the construction of Fides et Ratio, and given also his lucid later comments on this extraordinary encyclical, perhaps his attack on relativism might be extended, as the encyclical itself does, to various forms of postmodern thought that have reneged on the truth. For example, the postmodern thought of Lyotard, Foucault, Derrida, and his many followers. And once again, Vittimo, who thinks with Nietzsche that truth is nothing but the play of interpretation. Now, whether or not one agrees that Ratzinger's reputation extends to postmodern thinkers, who after all are not explicitly named by him, is not open for debate. What is not controversial, however, is that Ratzinger diagnoses modern reason to be truncated and essentially reducible to instrumental reason and the utility that accrues to it. This is its pathology. The pathology, I suppose, of its cancerous metastasis over the entire field of knowing. Though hardly a lover of critical theory, and even less about its use in Catholic theology, nonetheless, Ratzinger's critique of instrumental reason recalls a critique by Adorno and Horkheimer, and further advanced by Habermas, which is not to say that the more complete conspectus of reason proposed by Ratzinger agrees with that found in critical theory. That depends, after all, on reason's ability to correct and develop and become sharper and more intellectually penetrating, without, however, reaching a final state of rest in the full satisfaction of the correspondence of the intellect and the real. For Ratzinger, truth is possible and is achievable when knowing is required to exceed the knowable universe and is dealing with a reality such as God and God's relation to the world. Ratzinger is prepared to make the claim in the teeth of the general skepticism that marks modernity, that either philosophy or theology has the power to redeem. As I move towards my conclusion, as I did previously with de Lubac, I want to speak to the drama of Christian humanism in Ratzinger, both in terms of fundamental option in the context of a secular modernity regulated by Enlightenment axioms and mandates, and definitively beset by alternative construals of reality, of imaginative, aesthetic, and intellectual pedigree. I take it to be a settled matter at this stage of the argument that the Christian humanism proposed by de Lubac and Ratzinger is contextually and situationally dramatic. In the case of Ratzinger, I think we can add that the dramatic nature of Christian humanism, of the Christian humanism proposal and or counter-proposal, is exacerbated insofar as the alternative visions that press hard upon Christians and the church come to be seen as temptations. Yet what, according to Ratzinger, is this vision? What are its basic principles? And what are its practices? And how does vision bear on the other two? I will try to address these questions by focusing attention, very brief attention, on the first three encyclicals of Benedict XVI. The first, Deus Caritas Est, is a shockingly original encyclical in that it focuses on the central Christian vision and claim, from which everything follows, that God is love. It is the ultimate abbreviation of Christianity, a synopsis of the synopsis provided by Introduction to Christianity. It is the summary of the biblical text, as well as the 2,000-year reflection and pondering of the text. It's also a digest of all doctrine and liturgy and the mystery grasped, lived, and died into by believers over 2 millennia. The vision is also a source from which all doctrines, ethical precept, and Christian discipline springs. At the core of the vision, which is only provided a formal indication, the proposition-like formula of 1 John 4:6, is the symbol of the Word made flesh, the union not only of the divine and the human, but the correspondence of the message with the messenger, who directs us in the uncanny and unreliable world by forming us to see in the way in which he sees, to the point of seeing Christ in the stranger and engaging in forms of charity that exceed justice. I'm on my last page. It is this vision that informs, or ought to inform, even regulate, the Christian form of understanding of the economy, the state, international relations, and encourage us to marshal and deploy all the resources of Catholic social teaching in our assessment of our responsibilities towards the other and the world. Caritas in Veritate, the third of Benedict's encyclicals, carries through in some detail the enucleation of this vision by specifying the inalienable dignity of the person that is qualified neither by age, gender, social circumstance, or where one lives, and by spelling out what integral human development of the individual and societies that cannot flourish, obviously, in situations of abject poverty, but also cannot be fully realized without freedom of religion, freedom of association and expression, and without a culture that is operational and intact. Caritas in Veritate represents a kind of deduction of principles from the hot core of the vision of Christianity, a kind of explicatio to the implicatio, to use Nicholas of Cusa's language, of the vision that uniquely identifies Christianity and the subjects that it forms. The vision is pregnant and unfolds in practices and forms of living, as well as precepts and doctrines. The principles and practices adduced do not operate in a resistanceless medium. There is a gravitational pull towards human beings, being considered as fungible assets, and of a tendency towards construing development solely in material terms. And perhaps if we recur to the second of Benedict's encyclical Spe Salvi, there is also the shadow of the alternative of revolutionary forms of consciousness. For example, Marxism legitimating the destruction of the world in order to repair it. Thus, once again, the two modern reagents with which Christianity has to deal: the dictates of reason that are everywhere and nowhere, and visions that evoke passion and sacrifice. If Christians everywhere find themselves inhaling the fumes of the former, that is of the Enlightenment, they also find themselves beset by the latter. That is, these visions, which excite in a way old things, such as Christianity and the church, do not excite that seem to be stuck in amber. Yes, but I have said this before. This is the dramatic, maybe apocalyptic stage in which Christianity and the church finds itself in the secular age. That the drama is not simply contextual or situational. The Christian vision is substantively and not situationally, or merely situationally, a vision of cross and resurrection. The crux goes much deeper than the drama of choice. It also points to the suffering to be undergone in a drama of historical unfolding, with respect to which we are neither authors nor directors, but rather actors who find themselves in the dark with regard to knowing how the play is going to turn out, sometimes hoping against hope, that all will be well and all manner of things well. The church is a sensorium of the mystery that begot or begets it, but it is on the side of pistis rather than gnosis. It requires of itself to think, to act in order to bring about a world that corresponds to the kingdom, and expects to suffer and to wait and to never lose hope when darkness descends and when blacker than black, it is hard for any of us to make our way. Even more particularly, it requires us to think of our modern world with appropriate gratitude for the gifts that it has showered on us, but mindful also of the ways in which it impedes or makes impossible the kind of Christian humanism laid out in Ratzinger's first three encyclicals. This mindfulness is a necessary feature of the constellation of features that define the Christian subject. Augustine taught us to think in this way. Perhaps we might remember it. Just as we might also remember that Ratzinger thinks after Augustine, and we might add Irenaeus. That doctrine, intellectual and moral instruction, reading scripture, and participation in liturgy enable us not so much to solve our historical and systemic contradictions, but to live them. Christianity is not only dramatic in a deeper way than enlightened reason, and the totalizing visions that seem to feature or figure against the background, but reveal both the Enlightenment reason and these other visions to be too knowing and thus too undramatic in principle. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor O'Regan, for this terrific presentation. You can imagine how your paper is interesting to us as a research community supported by 6 Catholic universities and working on the category of humanism and on the contemporary forms of humanism. I can't sum up, resume your presentation in a few words, but I would say that you presented the Christian humanism as a sort of dramatic fundamental option, I think. And I think it's quite important to us as a researchers and as a believers. We have now time for questions, and I think we have 10, 15 minutes for questions. I have a question for you, and my question is about memory. Today and in your work, memory plays a crucial role, but it's an embodied memory. It's a sort of symbolic memory, I think, which has to do with a real presence. It's a memory which is not just the memory of something which happened, but something which is now happening. Could you say something about this symbolic dimension?
Yes. In my work in general, I try to avoid moralizing, telling you what you ought to think. Everyone is telling everyone else what they ought to think. I take it the best of philosophy. I was trained as a philosopher and became a theologian. The best of theology is an invitation. The invitation, of course, sometimes has arguments, but if you follow what I'm trying to say here, arguments cannot be persuasive unless somehow or other there's a vision that is the ground of the argument. And so let's say with respect to memory, which is the question I've been asked. I could say, if I was being moralistic, it's better to remember. I could tell you, remember and don't forget. But that surely is not going to help. The issue is, why would you want to remember either as an individual or as a culture and a society? Why would you do that? What will it do for you? What will it do for your humanity? What will it do in terms of trying to move towards what it is, what it really is to be human? I want to say, and perhaps Milan Kundera helps me in this, in the terrible lightness of being, Kundera suggests that he's also going to sanction. He suggests, it's appalling, but he sanctions it, that not to have any connection with the past. In other words, to dissociate with the past, not to have memory with the past, not to have memory also with respect to one's own past. That sort of is the peculiar modern way of existing. I take it that to follow what I've been saying via de Lubac and via Ratzinger is to say that not merely is that sort of not, shall we say, a kind of form of life that we admire. The issue has got to do with the mandate to forgetting, the operation of forgetting. Where does it leave you? I would say it leaves you sort of in two spaces simultaneously. It leaves you in the space whereby you've got freedom with respect to asserting that you have transcended the finite order of dependence, dependence on the past, dependence upon other people, dependence upon institutions. So it gives you an idea sort of with respect to your quasi-divinity. On the other hand, it leads actually to your nothingness and your erasure, because by not remembering, by actually instantiating forgetting, you actually are becoming a living emblem of nothing. So how one can live sort of that sort of no particular diet of where one is on the one hand being reduced to nothingness, and on the other hand sort of you have the fantasy projection with respect to divinity. What Ratzinger and de Lubac are suggesting is the full accomplishment of your finitude, but also, oddly enough, the full accomplishment of being enfleshed. Memory is the way of being embodied and enfleshed. We could say two rather different things, but the two sides of the same coin, and both need to be uttered. If we go to Irenaeus and Augustine in the early church, there's this sense in which, and I think it's already there in Irenaeus, so I'm going to give him credit. I always want to give Augustine credit for everything. Irenaeus is performing in the Christian tradition the first complex and total act of memory on behalf of the church. It is not an accident that as he performs this memory, the persons against whom he is writing this are Gnostics. The Gnostics refuse to have memory of what a church is or was, of who was in that church. They refuse a memory of my neighbor and what my neighbor has done. The only memory, which is a non-memory, is the conviction that one is not enfleshed, one is not embodied. So Irenaeus gives the clue that we can have, on the one hand, memory of different things. The Gnostic has a memory of who he really was. The Christian has a memory of who he really was, where he was placed, where he was born. He's got a mother and a father. And he's got a church, he's got a community, he's got a society, he's got practices. All of those indicate embodiment, indicate enfleshment, and are so that, as Irenaeus suggests, these are not the things to disdain. These are the glory of man. So in this instance, when and if you do not have memory with respect to that which is given, the consequence of it is of a perpetual disembodiment, a perpetual definitizing and infinitizing. And therefore, the way I'm reading for today at least, de Lubac and Ratzinger, is to provide an invitation. Here is the crossroad. It's a crossroad of memory, of how memory will give you something, and it will actually put you in the between in which we all are. We are, there's a doctrine of creation, I think, indicated. We are between the divinity as one pole of our stretching. And we we have left graciously because of God, if we're Christians, we've left nothing behind. That's where we're placed. And that in between is a dramatic structure whereby we can have despair, which will allow us to gravitate towards nothing, or delusion, which will allow us to go towards infinity, and not accept that we were given to ourselves and given to each other as a form of grace, as a form of gratuity, and that is what needs to be accepted. Our belonging, our flesh, our embodiment, our social flesh, our communal flesh. That, I think, knows what is at stake.
More questions? from the audience. Yes, yes, please. Yes, come here, Michael. Yes.
Hello? Thank you very much. A wonderful talk. Very much appreciated. Two questions come to mind that I'd like to ask. One was, did Ratzinger himself self-consciously identify as a Christian humanist? And if so, if not, what do you make of that? So that's one question. I don't know enough about Ratzinger. And second is, I was very interested in the way in which you're linking Christian humanism to actual concrete construction of politics and relationships. And I don't see Christian humanism very much within contemporary Christian political thinking today, or explicit in sort of explicit ways. Not in the way it was for Lubac or Maritain in the building of Christian democracy. We hear a lot about post-liberalism, about Christian nationalism, about conservative nationalism. So I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit, or just help me think a little bit, because I'm very interested in Christian humanism as a political project as well. Is there space for Christian humanism in sort of the Christian political thinking or action today? Where do you see that, or how would you see that maybe activating or reactivating itself? Thanks.
Right. So on the first question, Ratzinger has no particular interest, I think, sort of in making the claim sort of that, look at me, I'm a Christian humanist. Because it's not merely that it's a contested category, it also is a category that probably has lost its power sort of in and through various critiques. That is, the great Catholic both and. That you can have society, you can have religion, and so there's a kind of mediating force and so forth. So in that sense, does he explicitly avow that, put up the hand and I belong to that particular set or subset? No, he doesn't. But he actually does perform it, right? And I say, A, he performs it, and second, I'm going to give you its register. He has a particular register, which is not the register of Erasmus. He performs it insofar as, does he or does he not? For those of you who have read some Ratzinger, that if I was teaching an undergraduate course and I was looking sort of at my undergraduates and kind of trying to think about what they might have read or what they know about Ratzinger, is they probably, in the first day of class, if I asked them, they might say, oh, Ratzinger is that theologian who seems to be anxious to bring together faith and reason. That seems to me to be entirely, I mean, he goes beyond that, insofar as he does mandate that encounter with culture. He practices, as we well know, he will talk to anyone and everyone, right? He will talk to Kuhn, right, whom he disagrees with. He'll talk to Metz, with whom he disagrees. He'll talk to Habermas, with whom he disagrees. So this idea sort of that you're not talking to yourself, that Christianity's to the degree to which sort of Christianity sort of is what it is, to the degree to which sort of it sort of is persuaded sort of by its own riches and its own tradition. It wants to go forward to the world with something to give the world. It doesn't want to encounter the world with empty hands. It also in Ratzinger, it's not merely that it wants to give something with its hand, it also wants to receive. There is a palm open to receive as well. So in terms of both what he says, in terms of his performance, I think he absolutely satisfies the description of Christian humanism. Now, what is its register? The reason I think why it seems to me so that formaliter, right, he satisfies the definition. Why is it the case that you mightn't think of him as satisfying the definition? I take it that he might seem not to satisfy it, is that the kind sort of Christian humanism that he is promoting, and I think de Lubac is promoting, is Augustinian in nature. It's not Erasmian. If we mean by Christian humanism that the negotiation with culture and society is you bring nothing to the table. In fact, you're invited not to bring anything to the table. You're just invited to feed from the table and become what the table makes you. So, in other words, you go forward to culture, and then you allow the culture of society to dictate who you are. Ratzinger thinks that's not a negotiation. That sort of is a occupation, so there's no by sort of a contemporary culture. You go towards the culture pretty much as Augustine outlines in the Doctrina Christiana. You go towards the culture as constituted by opportunity and risk. There are opportunities. And Augustine sort of talks about the spolia Egyptorum, the spoils of the Egyptians, which you can take on board. And some of those spoils are incredibly significant. Augustine was able to take on board the spoil of Greek philosophy, largely sort of Platonic or Neoplatonic. He was able to take on board ancient rhetoric. But your encounters sort of with culture and society is also the means by which you discover what you can take on board. Catholic Christianity, and then this I think is true of both Ratzinger and de Lubac. Unlike the Reformation, which refused, at least, shall we say theoretically, if not in fact, to negotiate with culture, Catholic Christianity is always going to negotiate. The question sort of is the manner of the negotiation. And what Ratzinger suggests is the manner of negotiation should sort of be that you assimilate. But just as you're inviting someone to your house, hopefully the invited guest behaves himself or herself and doesn't ransack your house. And so there's a principle of discernment which is required. That is, you invite sort of that which is not intrinsically alien into yourself, as that actually allows you to understand yourself better and to understand your obligations to the world and the neighbor better. But there's some kind of things you cannot invite. In other words, it really is not you send an invitation to everyone under every possible circumstance. I take it you don't invite a terrorist, right, into a public building. And on the Augustinian account, as Augustine sort of now is making his way through sort of in the Doctrina Christiana at the end of the 4th century, beginning of the 5th century, he provides the model that Erasmus half recalls. Because Erasmus sort of seems to be sort of that, well, much of what goes sort of, we can invite it in. So if that sort of is the model unless we're all Erasmian, we cannot sort of use the locution Christian humanist. My suggestion is that more typically, Christian humanism has not been Erasmian. It has been invitational and critical simultaneously. And this I take it to be, let's say, to give a concrete example. When Ratzinger is thinking of Vatican II, and when he's thinking about the relationship between Lumen Gentium and Gaudium et Spes, obviously, for those of you who know Ratzinger, you know that Lumen Gentium sort of is, a golden text for him. And we know, of course, equally then, for liberals, the golden text is Gaudium et Spes. And of course, those who then will support the latter, that is Gaudium et Spes, have really an interest in dissociating it from Lumen Gentium. But at some points, Ratzinger just simply says the following. He says that Gaudium et Spes is a wondrous text in most ways, but it doesn't actually practice an iota of suspicion with respect to the modern world that you're going to negotiate with. And that is that to use sort of a kind of Catholic adjective, which perhaps sometimes does too little work, but I'm going to invoke it here. And that is that gaudium et spes is not sufficiently balanced between opportunity and risk. And therefore, yes, are we talking about human rights? Can we take that on board? Yes, we can. We're talking about freedom of religion. Can we take that on board? Yes, we can. And now, to be fair to Ratzinger, who, as far as I'm concerned, does get calumnied as a conservative, that's a long list he's going to invite on board. But he's not prepared to invite on board any number of other things. That is, those things, so there's no which, are going to, if you like, leach your Catholic identity. That, so there's no will challenge ultimate moral imperatives, etc. So, though Ratzinger, I take it, is not a Jesuit, as we know, and perhaps not Ignatian. But in the end, so there is this Ignatian call, that is, the principle of discernment. The principle of discernment, as we go forward, as we make our way, so there's no in via, we have to assume that some things are going to be roadblocks, other things are going to be temptation, and other things are going to be untrammeled goods, which we can safely take on board, and which will make us better Christians, and make us better Catholics, and will also make us affirm, as we ought to, all that is good in the world, all that is good in society, all that has been given to us in history in terms of institution. And your second question was, yes, the political. Well, the political, I suppose, in some sense, we all know so that, given that Deus caritas est, is probably, if Ratzinger were a poet, Deus caritas est is his poem, is his lyric poem, which suggests everything else. What I said was, and I think it's quite extraordinary, Deus caritas est, written by a pope, not written by a committee. This seems to me to be just have the hand of Ratzinger all over it. Is a summation of everything he wrote. It is a summation, as far as he's concerned, of what the Christian vision is, boiled down to its absolute quintessence. But as it's boiled down to its quintessence, after all the doctrines, after all sort of our assimilation of creed, our living sort of in practices of liturgy, sort of a living through prayer and so forth, this is what it is. So the vision that it brings to the world is, and I think he thinks it's necessary, rather than sort of analytic arguments. What, in essence, you've got 3 seconds to say, who are we? Who are we as Christians? Who are we as church? And we sort of are, who we are defined by is this vision, God is love. That sort of is the synopsis. But this synopsis itself is so infinitely thick and dense. And from that, we can then begin to talk about what our responsibilities are towards our neighbor. What does it mean to be sort of fully human? What does it mean to be fully human in society? What does it mean to be fully human as an individual? What shall we say? And again, I'm going to go back to Augustine. If this is our vision, that is, it's the vision of God as love, and that is there's something which is not within the immanent frame and not explicable within the immanent frame, then this love that God is, that love gives us weight. The pondus amor, the weight of love. We carry the weight of love. But we carry the weight of love only by distributing it, by specifying it, and by living in a moment of its transaction and action. And that's probably what I would say.
Thank you very much, Cyril. Now we want you to keep a good memory of today, so I have a couple of gifts for you. I received a mandate from our rector, so I have 2 gifts for you. The first gift is the LUMSA tie.
Thank you very much.
The LUMSA tie.
I appreciate this very much. It's the one piece of clothing that I really like. Otherwise,
Great.
I go around in sackcloth.
Good to know. Great. I don't use the tie,
That's
so
right, that's right. I came to tie for the occasion.
Yes.
I overdress.
But most important, I have for you the LUMSA medal from our rector, and so
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much.
thank you, Tere. Thank you. Yeah. This gift I'm having an Italian panettone, so that for Christmas. Yes, that's to eat at Christmas with your family. Okay, thank you very much, and we have a sort of a Italian aperitivo now. You can have something to eat and to drink and enjoy. Thank you very much to everybody.